Her fingers shook as the guards lifted her and placed her inside the carriage. She was 16 years old. Official court archives would later record her as Consort Han, one of the Korean tribute women delivered to the Ming court, and in that moment she was being surrendered to the ruler of China. Her mother cried openly while pressing her mark onto the paper. She could not write her name, so she dipped her finger in ink. One fewer daughter to keep alive, one fewer mouth to feed when crops failed and hunger returned. Han spent weeks traveling inside a sealed carriage alongside 15 other young Korean women. They were forbidden to look outside. They were forbidden to speak to one another. One girl attempted to flee. She was captured, brought back, and her hand was crushed as punishment. Infection followed. She died days later. Her body was discarded beside the road. The remaining girls understood immediately. Defiance would not save them. When the massive gates of the Forbidden City shut behind her, Han realized that serving the Son of Heaven had nothing to do with dignity or honor. She would spend 16 years within those walls. She would witness an entire harem erased in a single night. She would beg for one final glimpse of her mother, and she would die wrapped in white silk. Han's story did not begin uniquely. It followed a pattern shared by tens of thousands of others, shaped by a system engineered to collect young women the way fields collect harvests. When people imagine Chinese imperial concubines, they picture refinement, graceful figures and embroidered robes composing poetry in quiet halls, a life of privilege spent beside the most powerful man in Asia. That image is fiction. It is propaganda. The imperial concubine system existed for more than 2,000 years. Across that span, tens of thousands of women vanished behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. And what most people fail to grasp is this. Concubines were not wives. They were not considered people under imperial law. They were categorized as valuable objects, legally equated to porcelain vessels. Every 3 years, imperial officials traveled throughout the provinces in a process known as the Shunu selection. The name sounds refined. It was not. This was not an audition. It was a compulsory extraction. During the Ming Dynasty, no household was exempt. Every unmarried young woman of qualifying age had to be presented. Concealing a daughter was a capital offense. Entire families could be executed for refusal. Candidates were inspected by eunuchs and palace physicians. Every part of their bodies was examined for flaws, scars, birthmarks. Any imperfection meant rejection. Those who passed were taken. Their families received a small payment. Refusing the money was impossible. Declining compensation was treated as defiance of the emperor himself. The system did not rely on force alone. Poverty ensured compliance. And for the families left behind, what followed was silence. Most never heard from their daughters again. Letters were forbidden. Visits were unthinkable. In rare cases, if a concubine rose high enough in rank, her family might receive a stipend. For most, their daughter simply disappeared. Some families performed funerals for girls who were still alive, because they understood the reality. The child they raised no longer existed. Han entered China under a different classification. Korea sent women to the Ming court as part of diplomatic tribute. Between 1408 and 1435, more than 100 Korean women were delivered to the Forbidden City, not as guests, as property. The moment Han crossed the palace gates, her identity ended. She became inventory, a possession of the Son of Heaven. But before service came destruction. The women were not sent directly into the harem. First came refinement, a process lasting anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. The first stage was the erasure of identity. Their hair was cut, a mark of humiliation in Chinese culture. Their names were stripped away and replaced with numbers or generic titles. Speaking of family was prohibited. Mentioning one's mother resulted in physical punishment. Any personal items brought from home were confiscated and burned. The women slept in crowded barracks, 20 per room. They were awakened before dawn and kept working until long after midnight. Month after month, exhaustion was used as a weapon. Resistance became physically impossible. The second stage was submission training. The women learned dozens of distinct bows. They practiced for 8 hours each day. An improperly executed bow resulted in beatings with bamboo rods across the legs. Many carried those scars for life. They were trained to walk silently, to lower their eyes, to anticipate commands, to occupy no space, to smile while breaking inside. One Qing dynasty training manual listed 47 separate rules governing how to stand before the emperor, 47 ways to exist in a single moment. Violation of any rule meant punishment. The third stage prepared them to serve the emperor himself. The details are recorded in cold administrative language. Monthly examinations, repeated procedures. Palace medical notes from the 18th century described candidates showing resistance and requiring multiple preparation sessions. The words are clinical, the reality was not. Official documents discuss these women the way one would discuss livestock conditioning. Those who survived were declared ready to enter a system where suffering was only beginning. Once training ended, the women were absorbed into the official hierarchy, and with it began another layer of torment. The structure of the imperial harem was rigid and unforgiving. At the summit stood the empress, the emperor's sole legitimate wife. Beneath her were the imperial consorts, followed by several ranked tiers of concubines. At the very bottom were the common concubines, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and below even them were the preparation women, girls whose fate had not yet been decided. Rank governed every aspect of existence. It dictated how much food a woman received, the color and fabric of her clothing, the size of her quarters, the number of servants assigned to her, even the type of bowls from which she was allowed to eat. The empress was allocated more than 20 pounds of prime meat each day. A low-ranking concubine received only a fraction of that, often less than 4 pounds. And even this meager ration rarely arrived intact. Corrupt eunuchs siphoned supplies before they reached the kitchens. Many women at the lower levels suffered chronic malnutrition. Teeth loosened and fell out, hair thinned, bodies aged prematurely. And the cruelest irony was that their deteriorating appearance made them even less likely to be chosen, locking them into a downward spiral engineered by the system itself. The emperor did not visit his concubines. They were summoned. Each night, a senior eunuch presented the emperor with a set of wooden tablets, each engraved with a name and portrait. These represented the women deemed available. The emperor indicated one. From that gesture, a ritual unfolded with mechanical precision. The chosen woman was escorted to the bathing palace. Female attendants washed and prepared her, but she was not dressed afterward. Instead, she was wrapped tightly in a silk covering, leaving only her face exposed. Clothing could conceal weapons. Nakedness removed at risk. 2 eunuchs carried her to the imperial chamber. At the threshold, they unwrapped her and placed her on the floor. She was required to crawl toward the emperor without lifting her gaze. Throughout the entire encounter, a chief eunuch remained in the room, concealed behind a screen, but fully present. His role was to measure time. After precisely 30 minutes, he announced aloud that it was time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven. The emperor was expected to conclude immediately. If he did not, the eunuch would enter and physically remove the woman. Afterward, the concubine was examined by an imperial physician. Every detail was recorded. These records served a single purpose. If pregnancy occurred, there had to be absolute certainty regarding paternity. The woman's body became a ledger entry. Yet what defined the system most was not what happened to the chosen women, but what happened to the rest. The overwhelming majority of concubines were never summoned, not once. In some periods, the harem held more than 1,000 women. The emperor might select 1 or 2 in a given week. The mathematics were merciless. A woman could spend decades waiting for a summons that would never come, aging quietly, watching younger girls arrive, knowing that the sole reason she had been taken from her family would never be fulfilled. She could not leave. She could not marry. She could not form a family elsewhere. She existed as property placed into permanent storage, alive but functionless, with nothing to do but wait. Under these conditions, the women turned against one another. The imperial harem was not merely a prison, it was an arena. Hundreds of women competing for the attention of a single man, all aware that one pregnancy could elevate them or destroy them. A hidden war unfolded behind palace walls for centuries. Poisoning was common. Bribes were paid to eunuchs to remove rivals from the nightly tablets. Rumors were spread deliberately to cause women to fall from favor. Records document cases of concubines slipping abortifacients into the tea of pregnant rivals. If the child died, so did the mother's prospects. This logic governed palace life long before later dynasties. One of the few women to rule China in her own name allegedly strangled her newborn daughter and accused a rival concubine of the crime. That concubine was executed. Whether the story is factual is debated, but its plausibility reveals everything about the culture it emerged from. Violence was not always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines tormented juniors. Favorites were isolated and undermined. Alliances formed and shattered based on a glance at dinner. One Qing-era account describes a woman who feigned friendship with a rival for 3 years, only to testify against her during an investigation into disloyalty. The rival was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken away. This cruelty was not random. It was survival. In a system where women possessed no power except through imperial favor, destroying competitors became the only viable strategy. The tragedy was that the system transformed victims into perpetrators. Women who had been abducted, conditioned, and stripped of identity learned to inflict the same harm on others, because refusal meant destruction. And if a woman survived this internal war and gained the emperor's attention, if she became pregnant, the nightmare deepened. Pregnancy, contrary to expectation, was not a blessing for a low-ranking concubine. It was often a sentence. Common sense suggested that carrying the emperor's child would elevate a woman's status. In reality, it exposed her to a different form of control. Once pregnancy was confirmed, the woman was removed from the harem and relocated to the most isolated sections of the Forbidden City. For 9 months, she lived under constant surveillance. She could not receive visitors, she could not send messages. She was forbidden from walking freely through the palace grounds. Every movement was monitored. Every word was noted. When the child was born, separation was immediate. If the infant was male, he was taken away and placed in the care of wet nurses, raised far from his biological mother. She might be allowed to see him once or twice a year, always supervised, never permitted to hold him. If the child was female, records often ended there. Imperial archives frequently fail to document the fate of daughters born to low-ranking concubines. They simply vanished from the written record. The fear of this outcome drove some women to desperate measures. Historical documents describe concubines secretly consuming abortive herbs, fully aware that the substances could kill them. Death was preferable to condemning a daughter to the same cycle. In cases where a son died, the consequences were equally severe. Mothers were blamed regardless of cause. Even when children succumbed to common illnesses, the concubine could be accused of negligence or worse. Punishments ranged from demotion to exile within the palace. Some were confined to remote buildings and never allowed to re-enter court life. One Qing dynasty record tells of a woman who lost 3 children to smallpox. Rather than receiving sympathy, she was accused of harboring corrupted fate. She spent the next 40 years confined to a single chamber, forbidden from seeing any member of the imperial family. Her crime was survival. Her punishment was isolation until death. As brutal as daily life within the harem was, nothing prepared the women for what occurred in the year 1421. Emperor Yongle had recently completed the Forbidden City. His authority was absolute. Then a rumor spread that destroyed thousands of lives. One of his favorite concubines was found dead. Officially, poison was blamed. Unofficially, whispers claimed she had taken her own life after an illicit relationship with a palace eunuch. Worse still, the rumor suggested impotence on the emperor's part. Yongle's response was not investigation, it was eradication. Enraged and humiliated, he ordered a purge designed not to uncover truth, but to eliminate anyone who might know it. In a single night, approximately 2,800 women were executed. Not only concubines, but servants, cooks, attendants, any woman who might have overheard something, anything. The method chosen was execution by 1,000 cuts, a punishment designed to prolong agony. Executioners were instructed to take their time. Some victims suffered for hours before dying. The screams echoed through the palace until dawn. Girls barely 12 years old were included, women who had served the palace for decades, pregnant concubines. Status offered no protection. By morning, palace courtyards had to be scrubbed with water hauled from the wells. Those same wells would later become places of quiet suicide. There's no official Ming record of this massacre. The court erased it completely. What survived came from outside China. A concubine named Lady Q was absent from the palace that night, visiting a sick relative. She escaped by chance. Years later, she dictated her account to a Korean envoy. She described blood-slicked stones, eunuchs dragging bodies through corridors she had walked daily, the sound of screaming that did not stop until daylight. She named women she had known, trained beside, eaten with. Her testimony was preserved in Korean diplomatic archives, beyond the reach of Ming censors. It remains one of the only first-hand records of that night. Lady Q did not escape for long. When Emperor Yang Li died 3 years later, she was selected for another ancient practice, accompanying sacrifice. During the Ming dynasty, favored concubines were buried alive with deceased emperors. The logic was horrifyingly simple. The emperor would require attendance in the afterlife, just as he had in life. 3 days after an emperor's death, eunuchs compiled a list of women to be sacrificed. Between 5 and 30 were chosen, depending on reign and favor. The selected women were given a final meal, lavish dishes they had rarely tasted, wine usually forbidden to them. Some accounts describe musicians playing as they ate, as though attending a celebration. Afterward, they were offered a choice: to hang themselves voluntarily using white silk cords, considered an honorable death that brought compensation to their families, or to refuse. In that case, they were restrained, drugged, or forcibly hanged. Their bodies, sometimes still breathing, were arranged seated in chambers surrounding the emperor's tomb. In 1958, archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Jingtai. Inside, they found the remains of 16 women seated upright. Skeletal analysis revealed cervical trauma consistent with hanging. 3 skeletons showed signs of struggle, fractured bones, deep scratches etched into stone walls. They had been buried alive. They had tried to escape. This practice ended in 1464, not because compassion prevailed, but because families of victims began to destabilize court politics. Han did not live to see its abolition. She died in 1424, 30 decades too early. When Han petitioned to return to Korea to care for her aging mother, the request was denied. She was hanged with white silk and interred beside the man who had destroyed her life. For those who survived after abolition, freedom did not arrive. Instead, concubines who outlived their emperors were confined to the palace of perpetual solitude. There they lived under strict rules: never leave, never marry, perform manual labor, and pray daily for the deceased ruler. For decades, they slept on mats, ate basic rations, and received medical care only if illness threatened others. Many lost their sanity, others stopped eating. Drowning in palace wells became the most common escape. During the 18th century, records suggest an average of 12 bodies per year were pulled from those wells, removed at night, unrecorded, one less number. The youngest recorded imperial widow was 14 years old. She had been married to an elderly emperor for 3 months. She spent the next 61 years confined, dying at 75 after a lifetime of enforced mourning. The last imperial concubine died in 1946. She spent her final years in a communist prison, addicted to opium, having lost all her children. She was buried in an unmarked grave. The system ended. The palace remains. Millions of tourists walk its courtyards each year. They admire golden roofs and imperial thrones. Guides speak of power and architecture. They do not mention the wells. They do not point out the palaces of isolation. They do not explain why some halls were sealed for decades. Some walls still carry marks left by desperate hands. Han was 16 when she entered the carriage. She was 32 when she died in silk. In those 16 years, she never saw her mother again, never went home, never heard her true name spoken with love. She was delivered as tribute, reshaped into property, used as a vessel, and buried as an accessory. She was one among tens of thousands. Over 2,000 years, historians estimate over 100,000 women passed through the concubine system. Most names were never written. Most stories were never told. They survive only as numbers, as bones, as ghosts in palaces now photographed for pleasure. Silence does not honor them. Forgetting does not absolve anyone. The walls still stand. The stones remember. And now, so do you. If you have listened this far, understand what that means. You have followed a story that was never meant to survive. These accounts were not preserved to be honored. They endured by accident, hidden in foreign archives, buried in court records, whispered by people who knew they would not be believed. Systems like this depend on forgetting. They depend on distance, on time, on the comfort of believing that beauty and power can exist without cost. The Forbidden City still stands at the heart of Beijing. Every year, more than 14 million visitors pass through its gates. They walk beneath yellow roofs, they photograph carved thrones, they hear stories of emperors, dynasties, glory, and achievement. They are not told about the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. They are not shown the wells where bodies were pulled from the water week after week. They are not told why certain courtyards were sealed for generations. Official narratives prefer silence. Silence is easier than reckoning. But the stones remember. The walls remember. And the system that placed women like Han inside those walls was not an accident of history. It was deliberate. It was maintained. It was justified for centuries. Han was not exceptional. She was typical. One young woman among tens of thousands taken, renamed, trained, and erased. Her life followed rules written long before she was born. Her death followed traditions defended as necessary. Her memory survived only because it slipped through the cracks of censorship. Over 2 millennia, more than 100,000 women passed through this system. Most left no trace, no names, no graves, no descendants who could speak for them. They existed as entries in ledgers, as figures in budgets, as bodies arranged around tombs. When the system ended, it did not end with justice. It ended quietly. The women who survived were locked away. The stories were buried. The palaces were repurposed. Remembering does not change what happened, but forgetting ensures it can happen again. If this story unsettled you, it should have. If it stayed with you, that is the point. These histories survive only when they are repeated, when silence is refused. And this is only one of them. There are more systems like this, more lives erased with precision, more walls that still stand while the people inside them are forgotten. If you want these stories to be told, stay, because what comes next is no easier to hear.